professional communication in English and teaching English for specific purpose. We all are lucky to have you, ma'am, with us. Please enlighten our audience with your words.
Thank you so much, Pragati, for that introduction. I am very new to your part of the world. I have never given a talk there, but I wish to do it as soon as possible. And this is a very good doorway to your world, I think. There is a bit of disturbance somewhere. I don't know where it's coming. So anyway, without wasting time, let me go straight to my PowerPoint, and I hope all of you can see it. Before I begin, let me tell you that when I was given this topic, I could not. My excitement over the topic, because it was kind of bringing my knowledge, or rather my education of psychology, sociology, and English language teaching all into one forum. And I was more than excited. And I must thank whoever has designed this topic, because it is kind of a interdisciplinary subject which will bring many interesting and many positive things from these various disciplines, and perhaps help us as English language teachers to educate our students about how the dynamics of communication is influenced by the individual himself and the structure in which he or she is communicating. So structures and communication and connecting it with emotional intelligence, I think, was a very, very intelligent connection that anyone has tried to put. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation, and for this dialogue between the different disciplines of humanities, where each complements the other. And till now, we were all operating in our own specific fields, not knowing that the insights from one field can help us to develop the competence of not only our students, but in the bargain, thereby we can all also benefit. So that is all about this topic. Now, how do I organize my talk? I think I would give a lot of importance to interaction. So I wish that we keep about a certain amount of time for question answers. I do not know how Dr. Panda has designed it or how others have been doing, but I prefer that there is a discussion around and not a one-way lecture. So, and I would like to people to join in or ask me or stop me whenever they feel that, whatever I'm saying, how it can be applied to their field, or whatever I'm saying makes sense in their field or doesn't make sense. So these kind of dialogues should go on as I'm giving the talk. So it should not be a one-way thing. It should be a two-way traffic. That's my first request to all of you. The second thing is that how I've designed it. I'll go a bit into the theory of why structure and communication, and then perhaps I will start with the basics of structure, communication, and emotional intelligence, and then I'll go into the theoretical background, and then talk with that. So the theoretical background could be a little challenging for people who are coming from a sound language or literature background, but however, I guess this is very important for us to understand, because communication is not a language or literature thing alone. It has got to do with sociology and psychology as well, because emotional intelligence itself is a psychological subject where research has been done with emotional intelligence as a quantitative construct. So we have to understand these conceptual or theoretical underpinnings behind the what should I say, linguistic dynamics that we are teaching our students. And that would, I think that would help us to understand what we are going to do with this structure, communication, and emotional intelligence. Please ask me questions if you have any about the theoretical parts when I come to. So that is the introduction. So let me take you to my second slide, which talks about I think I've opened a wrong file. Just give me a bit of time. I think I opened a wrong file. Why does this always happen? I don't understand. I think I should have learned my lesson from last time and shared the file with you first.
That will do, ma'am, please.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I've got it. I've got it. So now I shared this one, right? I saved it in your name saying that I will not be confused, but still again, I was confused. So this is the new file. I hope everyone got it. Is it, did everyone got it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So this is a new file. I'm sorry for the confusion. Right. So now first I start with emotional intelligence. So what is emotional intelligence? You all have been deliberating on him for the past 2 days. I don't want to go much into emotional intelligence, but however, as an introduction, I thought I should bring in emotional intelligence a little bit before we go, and why I think I'm getting emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, as I have put it in my slide, has 2 different facets to it. One is that what it is a perception of your own self, where you think that you are capable of handling emotions, you can manage stress, you can manage all the other constructs which come inside emotional intelligence is in my first bullet point. And in the second point, what I have said that emotional intelligence not only helps in doing things to us as an individual, but taking care of the environment, that is people around us. So these 2 things are very, very important. I think that you must have dealt with this part of the construct in your earlier sessions. Unfortunately, I could not attend to any of these sessions because of my classes that we have, but I am presuming that these factors of emotional intelligence must have been covered in your earlier things, and I do not want to go into it. However, I just thought I should put it up front so that we know what is, emotional intelligence and how it is connected with communication, because emotional intelligence is an individual characteristics. However, it has its bearings on how we deal with the environment, that is how we deal with other people in our environment, that is how our behavior, our other behavior motivates us or demotivates us in the arena of emotional intelligence. So that's about emotional intelligence. Now coming to social structures or structures as such. Now structures, as I find in the literature, I found that structures are that sociologists and linguists have dealt with are of 3 kinds, which are social structures, organizational structures, and the most recent thing that had started is the online structures. Now, we are all kind of facing it and perhaps experiencing it, that how online structures are different from offline structures. And when I say offline structures, in offline structures, how the organizational structures, or rather professional structures from which our professional communication starts or is derived, is different from the social structures which constitute our family, our other social institutions like marriage and kinship and other things that have driven the theory behind how communication should happen. So now the three very different development that has happened is that initially when the study of this communication started, it perhaps started from like if I take language, from spoken language to written language, and then from written language to speaking and reading and writing. And now most of the communication literature, if you find in language and literature, it's kind of little, they are trying to expand, but it is confined with reading, writing, and speaking. And there we had, I will come to those Bernstein theories of restricted codes and other things, but let me kind of give you a little, like what I'm trying to bring in is that the study of communication started with social structures, and then it became professional communication when it was brought into organizational structures. So we, scientists or social scientists, thought that professional communication is a little bit different than social communication or general communication. Now what we are facing is that we are still facing that online and offline communication, and all of us have realized that there is a big difference between online and offline communication, where certain things don't matter and certain things matter most. Like the fact that visibility is through a digital channel, that there is no physical proximity, and there is no whatever interaction happens is not physically, but through the online. So many things have changed on this online structures. So that needs to be taken into account in the 21st century, especially in 2020, when we are having this dialogue during the times of Corona, as we were just discussing before the presentation. So now this is a little hint about the structures. And then coming to the next slide, communication. Now communication is important because it has to deal with individual consciousness, how an individual communicates. It depends on his knowledge, orientation, attitudes, and that is why emotional intelligence becomes so important. However, we should not forget that communication is a necessary tool for human beings to manage the structures that they have built up. So it is in one way connected to the inside of inner world of the human being, and in other way to the outer world through which he or she connects. So these two things I will elaborate on when I'm going to the theoretical background of communication and the methodology through which communication has to build a bridge between the emotion of an individual, and that's why we need emotional intelligence, and then the structures that the person has built around him or her to kind of create and recreate human community to satisfy his or her needs. And sometimes the structures become so overwhelming that he or she succumbs to those structures in order to balance the inner needs of the human being. So that's a very complex kind of a relationship, which we will tear apart when we look at the theoretical bits of this whole three pillars that you have chosen. So now coming to how this three things, structure, communication, and emotional intelligence comes. Perhaps the macro thing is the structure, and within the structure, perhaps we are looking at, a structure which is a formal structure and not perhaps an informal structure. But however, we must remember that formal structure derives its meaning and its rationale from informal structures. and communication is perhaps the bridge through which the individual and hence the emotional intelligence of the individual makes a connection between the outer structure of which he or she is a part. Any questions till now? Anything that I've missed out? And so I've given you kind of a background to why or how these three constructs that you have put, structures, communication, and emotional intelligence, are connected. So I think emotional intelligence, when we are taking the individual, and then we are building the bridge through communication to the structures. So that is my kind of way of looking at the whole concept of this lecture. Now, then I come to the fact that why must be there a connection? And this is very interesting. When I was kind of trying to understand the concept or trying to establish a connection, all these theories that I had read in sociology and psychology somehow, found meaning, because the individual, the first point I will deal with is the ideological and the empirical. Like, we all live in a society where there are certain norms and certain ideologies which drive us for whatever we do, whether it is the social structure or the professional world. We are driven by an ideology. And that ideology tells us, like, let me take, for example, as a teacher, I'm told that, okay, I have to speak in English. This is a very, very basic thing. And the challenges we meet every day. While I was teaching in Hong Kong, students had their mother tongue as Chinese. And I can tell you that if I spoke in English, almost 90% of the students may not understand me. And I was a foreign teacher there. Now, how do I balance? Like, what do? I do not know their mother tongue. So now the ideological world is that you use English for communication in the class. The students are here to learn English from you. But the empirical reality is that not many students can understand you. So what do? We try to bridge a gap. So there your communication skills are challenged. And communication is such a skill that it has to take the empirical and the ideological into account. Now, if I say, and that is why some people are saying, no, don't teach children English. I was not of that view, because I made an argument that even if children did not understand me, they knew how to communicate. They knew how to tell me that they wanted to drink water. They knew how to tell me that they wanted to go to the washroom. So these things were happening. So the thing is, what I'm trying to say is, even in an organizational context and such a formal organization such as the school, we have difference between the ideological and empirical. And perhaps as an individual, we are creative and intelligent enough to kind of make the gap between the ideological and empirical. But we can make that gap, that bridge between the empirical and ideological only we have informed knowledge. If I'm in one world and say, no, you cannot speak anything other than English, or if I tell the teachers that, look, you are an English teacher. So the thing is that the communication has to take into account the ideological and the empirical. And the second important thing from there, I derive the reality and the interpretation. So as communication professionals, like even in, let me say, even in my undergraduate class, I see that when I say something, let's say this lecture in itself. So the reality is that all of us are professional communicators, or all of us teach students how to communicate. Now I'll come to this part again in my examples. Now, let's say a simple example like greetings. There are many ways in which greetings are taught, like when you are teaching email communication, or when you are teaching students how to greet in an interview. Now, the challenge is that if I tell people, I always ask my students, if you go to an interview and the person doesn't say good evening or good morning and gives you folds his or her hand, what do you do? So the immediate thing is that, do you touch his feet if he's an elderly person, or do you just fold your hand? These are very, very important, crucial elements of communication. And this has been, has been part of the communication genre now, but still people are confused about how to deal with it and what is the ideal way. And now here, the reality is something, the interpretation is something, and it will need an individual interpretation rather than a standard interpretation where we can tell people that, look, communicate, this is going to happen and this is your, so what I'm trying to say is it's a dynamic process, and we have to all understand that the reality and the interpretation will again depend on the participants and not upon some standardized rules or norms. Now, and that brings to my next question, what is epistemology and the theory? All the sociologists or psychologists who have found that there is a connection between your emotional intelligence and your normative behavior have found that they have derived their theory on the basis of some study. However, the fact remains that that study is one study, and it could be one of the unique studies, and each situation that we all face, it's a communication event, can be unique in itself. So the theory and the epistemology could be very different, though they are all derived from one. Yeah. So that is my connection in which I see structures, emotional intelligence and communication forming a triangle, and each being dependent on the other. Now I'll take you a little bit into the theoretical background where I'll bring in some psychologists and some sociologists, and Bernstein as a school teacher who did a very, very interesting study in the UK on restricted code and elaborate code. So I'll start with Talcott Parsons. Talcott Parsons was one of the sociologists who talked about individual autonomy and social order. So what he was, trying to show was that each individual, as we all know, we want to have our freedom. We want to do whatever we want. We want to have our autonomy. However, we also at the same time want to have social order. Right. So we know that in order to have social order, we have to give in, sacrifice some of our autonomy. And some people see this as a contradiction, but I think Talcott Parsons saw it as not as a contradiction, but as a given, because individuals, they understand that in order to have social order, there are many forces working on this, on him, and he somehow kind of balances those things to bring social order. If I bring that that theory into common examples, like all of us in a particular occasion, let's say Deepavali, we do some puja, or we all go to the temple. But then if as a sociologist I have to teach Marxism or something, I say religion is the opium of masses, there's a contradiction. That doesn't mean that I am not being fair to myself. That means only that I'm trying to amalgamate all the different social forces that are working on me. So I'm not here or not there, but I'm a total human being who is ready to accept that, okay, people are thinking like this, and some instances religion can be the opium of the masses, but for me, perhaps religion is working, and perhaps for certain people, religion should work, and why not? Or I could be an ardent believer in idol worship, and then if some people think that what is the point in worshipping a stone, I should be able to take that argument and think that perhaps his or her argument could be correct, because he is talking from his own experience. So these kind of contradictions should not be, what I'm trying to say is, it is perhaps Talcott Parsons, particularly when he did his research in the context of organizational communication or organizational structures, I think if we kind of implement that, there is a space for everyone. The kind of thinking that is now coming out from the global world is that there's a space for everyone. Nothing is good, or nothing is like, nothing is kind of like, if I am an educated person, doesn't mean that I cannot be a religious person. But about 10 years or 20 years back, if you have got Western education or modern education, or as they say, rational and scientific education, you should not be going to the temple, which I find, cannot be explained, because many of us will feel that, no, I feel religious, even though I find that there is some merit in my education. So the thing is that every individual deals with many different kind of social forces, and these social forces, this same person with his emotional intelligence or her emotional intelligence makes peace with all of them. So this is neither here or not there, but everywhere. And this person is an amalgamation of that. So when we are teaching our students, please do not expect that they will blindly follow a system just because that's the norm. However, if we tell them that in order to maintain social order, perhaps a little bit of individual autonomy has to be compromised, perhaps that's the way. Instead of the teachings that we earlier had, that individual autonomy should not be compromised in any other way. There are many thinkers even in this time who think that the absolute necessity for everyone or anyone is individual autonomy. However, we all realize that for social order, there needs to be some push and pull, or rather equilibrium with our individual autonomy. Now coming to the next point, which is Durkheim and my favorite, which is cultural practices. When he introduced the kind of cultural practices, Durkheim saw a very, very positive contribution of cultural practices to the consciousness for productive human activity. So what he said, that if human beings have to be productive, perhaps they have to take recourse. This is a very simplified meaning, but this is what I understand, is that if a human being has to be productive, or it has to be consciously productive, then the cultural practices can be beneficial for that person. So that doesn't mean that if you are a scientific person or you are indulged in a laboratory, you have to give up your cultural practices. Rather, your cultural practices perhaps can help you in doing a productive human activity. There's more to it, but I will not go to Durkheim and passions. I'll rather come to Bernstein and Vygotsky, who are more kind of connected to our language teaching. Now, Bernstein is a very, very interesting educationist, I should say, who did a study in the UK, and he was a school teacher. And he started by, looking at working class children. And he found that, working class children are using a kind of vocabulary or kind of a language which is not accepted in school. And the mainstream school order, whatever is the discourse of the mainstream, is more like the middle class and not the working class. Now, he went into a lot of controversy for this, and people kind of did not appreciate the thing. But as you read Bernstein today, you feel that he was not really trying to say that working class is not the accepted one. Rather, he found creativity in the working class language. And very, very interesting episode of how a working class mother uses toys that she finds in her locality to teach her child is a very, very interesting thing. And I would suggest people to read Bernstein, especially teachers, I think perhaps should read Bernstein. And people are reinventing Bernstein, and some, I think 10 years back or maybe 15, 20 years back, people poo-pooed Bernstein. But now his restricted code and elaborate code has become very, very important, and especially for linguistic challenges when we face as English language teachers, like when this concept of Singaporean English or Indian English came up, and it was considered that it is not standard English. So then there was a wave that, yeah, there is a need for native English to accept the other Englishes, and all these debates, and you all know more than me, and I won't go into that. But however, the fact remains that restrictive code and elaborative code. The fact is that as language teachers or as communication professionals, we should always remember that every society has hierarchy. Social stratification is an inherent feature of any society. However, we have to be aware that what is the organizational needs.
Ma'am. Hello.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, a restrictive code, may you please a little bit explain?
I will elaborate on that. I'll elaborate on that. So I was coming to that only. So I was trying to imagine that Indian English could be similar to what Bernstein meant by restrictive code. Now, what Bernstein did was actually he went to the working class, he collected their speech data, and then he said that, in the schools, this working class language was not used, and whatever language was used was from the middle class. Let's say when I mean language, I mean speech, vocabularies, words, even context, even sometimes what happens in working class, the way they pronounce things, they will do it halfway and they know the context. I'll come to that in the affect and effect. So the thing is that restrictive, but the problem why it was restrictive is because he said that because of this, they were not able to manage in school, which believed in the elaborative code, right? Does that make sense, or do you need more explanation? So restrictive code means like when in a particular family, like let me give a very simple example. In a particular family, if there is a communication within a mother and a child, they don't have to say the whole thing. If they say, okay, a particular word may have a meaning which only the family understands, or maybe only the community understand, or maybe only those speakers of the language understands. Like if I'm an Odia speaker and I said, Khailuni means, have you eaten? Now in English, I can't say Khailuni. I have to say, have you eaten? So the thing is that this in one sense is a very, very naive example, but this in a sense could be the restrictive code of my language. Right?
Okay, madam. Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. So, but in elaborative code, also in Odia, it is there that have you eaten? Tu khai sari luni ki. That's the full sentence is an elaborative code, but we don't use those elaborative codes when we are talking in a informal situation. But even in a formal situation, suppose we are teaching communication. This I find also in when I go to meetings and all. You all must have faced this, and moreover, I think in the South we see people use a very ceremonial language when they're introducing somebody and this and that. And now suddenly, this is becoming unfashionable to use this kind of ceremonial languages, because people have understood that why do we need to use these ceremonial languages when we can do without what is the, because we are comfortable. We are all comfortable with the language that we can do without the ceremony bit, what I mean to say. So this is what I mean by the ceremony, the restricted code and the elaborate code. But as communication professionals or as teachers of English, how much of the restrictive code can get placed in the formal organizational structure, and how much of the elaborative structure can be reduced? That's a fine balance, and neither you nor me can teach our students that every individual has to use the emotional intelligence to kind of deal with that particular students. However, my contention is that if we give students the examples of elaborate code and we make them aware of what is the restrictive code and how they need to deal with this situation, perhaps that's the ideal way to go about. And that is why in language teaching now we have culturalism and multiculturalism, and now no communication course in English is complete without without lesson rather on multiculturalism. And when we say multiculturalism, what do we mean? Do we tell people that, okay, you go and say namaste? No, we don't. But when Rajan, our defense, he's a defense minister, right? Defense minister goes and Rajnath Singh goes and shakes hand with the Russian diplomat rather than saying namaste during Corona times, we find a mismatch there. Why would you do it as a professional communicator or a professional in the defense field when you are a politician and you are kind of advocating that the cultural practices of Hinduism is much better, and we have namaste and we don't have handshake. And here, when you are going into a foreign context, only because they are pressurizing you, you are shaking hands. These kind of things can come only when we are confident about the knowledge that we have, that okay, I don't have to adapt other people's culture blindly, or my restrictive code is not very demeaning, or thing is that, and why is elaborative? If we start questioning why is elaborative code so very essential, and why can't I do with my restrictive code, and why can't I bring in people into my restrictive code? So these are the questions we should be making our students and thinking for ourselves also. Where is the line drawn, and why should there be a line drawn? Right. Now let me come to my next and very close to my heart, Vygotsky. Vygotsky was, all of you must be I have given the references in the slide of Vygotsky. He was a Russian who got translated, and the whole world was like gaga about the things that he had written. And perhaps the most important thing that he had written was scaffolding, which we all use with young learners when you are teaching them what kind of scaffolding or linguistic scaffolding we can think. And that's a very, very favorite term of early childhood educators, about how scaffolding at one time, it was one of the most interesting thing in language teaching. However, what I want to bring into this literature is not scaffolding, but inner speech. So what he said was that every individual has an inner speech, and that inner speech cannot be brought into public. So the individual is constantly dealing with the inner speech that goes on, and that inner speech cannot be uttered. I will come to all this in my next slides when I go to individual things. Till now, any other questions before I take you into a little bit into Talcott Parsons? Okay, so now Talcott Parsons is one of the sociologists, perhaps, who, when he dealt with the sociology of organization or social order and individual autonomy, he was treading into what we call now professional communication. And what he said, that individual autonomy, the individual is faced with such a sense of freedom or autonomy, which is so inherent in each individual, that whenever they want to make compromises to the social processes that I was earlier talking about, they do not remain passive recipient. They are conforming participants. Now, as language teacher, where do we stand? Now, what do we expect? Do we expect our students to be passive recipient, or do we want them to be conforming participants? You can only have them as conforming participants if whatever you are teaching them, you rationalize that, and then you put it in context for them, and they find positive results from that. This is very, very important for us as teachers of professional communication to see to that. And when I am saying conforming participant and passive recipient, I'm dealing completely with their emotional intelligence, because each individual autonomy is nothing but a manifestation of their emotional intelligence. If the person is less intelligent, perhaps he would be less conforming. I do not know. This is open for discussion. But there is a very, very thin line between autonomy and order, and what we should give up for what, that needs to be very, very clearly understood by teachers and then passed on to students. Because if we try to make them into passive recipients, we are not, perhaps not taking account of their emotional intelligence. And now, if we are asking them, you be participants, they can only be participants or active participants or motivating participants only if they conform to the order, conform to the norms which will make them, which will make them accept the social norms. So there is a very delicate relationship between how to maintain social order, and then it boils down to the individual emotional intelligence, and then the onus is on us as teachers, as professional communicators, to teach our students that this is what is happening. Occasionally, all of us must have felt that, why must I conform? Why must I listen to this diktat? But then when it comes to our own selfish interest, we think it is better to conform than to not to. And then it is in my interest that I conform. So if these things are logically taught to the students, I think most of the problems of communication or miscommunication can be handled in a very, very rational and intelligent way, perhaps. Now, the second point is connected to that, and it says that externally courteous and internally free. Here also, an emotionally intelligent person knows exactly that he has to be externally courteous, and internally he knows that why he is doing that. So he doesn't have pressure on himself that I'm doing and I don't want to do it, but I'm doing because I have to do it. And I'm perhaps then, when he makes that kind of connection, he is also not putting himself on pressure, and he does it on his own self-will. So this is a very, very important phenomena that Talcott Parsons had formulated, and perhaps it makes sense, or it has relevance in the context of professional communication and in connecting emotional intelligence with structures and emotional intelligence through communication. Now, the third and the most important point, perhaps I feel, is the unrestricted private and the ceremonial public, which I've already hinted in the beginning. So in our, this is more and more the private and public domain, which all of us face. And that is why the communication has to be, it has also got connection with the restricted and the elaborative code, and the unrestricted private and the ceremonial public. The question is that private will always remain unrestricted, right? Nobody has control over the private, but people can make or share that private, and certain common norms of the private can be brought into the public instead of being blocked. And certain bits of the grand ceremonial bits of the public that has become the norm could diminish. So this dynamic push and pull between the private and the public happens all the time, happens because these are social structures. And however, as teachers or professionals of communication, professional communicators, we should know that where the private ends and where the public starts, and how much of the public has to take into account the private, and how much of the private cannot go into the public. This domain has to be clearly defined for each and everyone, so that there is less of social disharmony or more of social order. So these concepts of social structures need to be understood by professional communicators, and hence I have put them, the three first I have put in the context of the individual, and then I've put in the context of the structures itself, and then the second one, on the middle one, is about the nature of both the individual and the structures. So I hope I'm making sense. So when I say social order and individual in autonomy, I'm trying to make a connection between social order and the individual. So now the individual, do you want the individual to be a passive recipient, or do you want it to be a conforming participant? That's the first question we need to ask ourselves. And the second question is that how much of the individual is internally free and externally bound? And when I say externally bound, how much of it is on the society and how much is in the individual? So these two are connected with and the third one is about the private, unrestricted private, and the ceremonial public, and it is totally about the structures which influence the individual. I hope it's all clear. If not, please ask me now, and I could go to the next theory. Now, theory, I know a little bit. I mean, presenting theory in a talk is always very challenging, but I thought it would add some meat to this discussion and perhaps make it meaningful. And that's the reason why I made it. But if you have questions, yeah, I mean, there are many tools in which you can make internally free. Like when I say internally free, suppose I'm teaching in a multicultural classroom like ours in this university. We have people from the south and people from the north, people from the northeast, people from east. So now internally free. So suppose I go into the class and I say, how would you, we always have a discussion about food in the class because, you know, we are we are a residential university and people have to eat food in a common mess. And sometimes they have South Indian lunches, sometimes they have Mumbai pav bhaji and some different kinds of things. And always I see that there is a you know, kind of a conflict, right? I'm putting it in a very simple term, kind of a conflict that, oh, this is not good and that's not good. But some things are there in which all of them agree, right? Like ice cream. Now I'm coming to, why is that ice cream is liked by everyone and not gulab jamun is liked by everyone? Is it because is it because we have in our attempt to become neutral, we have become Western and we think Western is the new neutral and that can be extended to many other things. But when I tell them that, okay, what is the sweet that you like, you know? And then sometimes they will keep quiet. So the thing is that, yeah, it is connected about internal freedom is connected about self-concept. Emotional intelligence is connected with self-regulation and self-perception. If you see in my first slide, I explained it that emotional intelligence is connected with self-perception. In fact, interestingly, since you asked this question, I'm just writing a paper now on self-perception, and we found out that when people see themselves talking, you know, I did a video recording of students, and then irrespective of whether they got feedback of their oral presentations or not, just by looking at their oral presentations, they all improved in their presentation skills. So the thing is that the self-perception which comes from looking, it's nothing. Emotional intelligence is just one facet. I mean, or rather, self-perception is a facet of emotional intelligence. We become more and more emotionally intelligent by looking at inside us, right? Most of us are not perhaps trained. I won't say trained, but nobody tells us that, you know, are you emotionally intelligent? What should you do to become emotionally intelligent? So self-perception. The questions about self can make a person more intelligent that way. I think a language teacher has to have, account of the social structure and has to have an account of the emotional intelligence of the students. Otherwise, language is what? Language is communication. It's a bridge between your inner world and the outer world, like what I'm just talking. And, you know, if you do not know where the child is coming from or where the student, what he wants to express, and you are just giving him a formula and saying, okay, this is the code, and you go and speak, how can it become productive or fruitful, and perhaps that's the challenge we all are facing. Now, what we have to do is we have to start from the learner rather than from our teaching. And all of us as teachers, we are so much engrossed in our own world, and we think so strongly about the things that we want to teach to our students, that we go there to the classroom and we start with our our kind of intuitions or our goals and aims, rather than taking into account the learners. But we have to flip it and perhaps take it more learner center, and then perhaps these things of a learner's emotional intelligence will test the teacher's emotional intelligence. That's my contention. Anything else, please? I think that's a very good way of putting your questions in the chat box, because it comes to me immediately. Yeah. Any questions on Talcott, or should I go to Bernstein now? Yeah. Now, Bernstein should create interest on teachers, because he himself was a researcher who started his career as a teacher, and he started his papers are on speech codes, which he theorized on the basis of the speech codes of his students. And then he found that codes reflect social structures and codes reflect intelligence. And I'm like, I do not know whether I have time, but I'm very tempted to talk about intelligence and languages. And if we see our own languages, certain languages we see, like let me take Odia and Hindi for example. In Odia, we don't have gender. In Hindi, they have gender for buses also. And in Odia, we don't change the gender with the verb. Like if a person eats, if a girl eats, the same verb is used. If a boy eats, the same verb is used. Does that mean? But in Hindi, if a girl eats, the verb changes, and if a boy eats, the verb. A girl and a boy eats, the verb changes, right? Does that mean? Can I interpret as that Odia language is more is not sensitive to gender, or rather more egalitarian? Right? So these are the questions we should be asking. And now, when you are teaching a Odia person Hindi, and you are, I faced this problem when I came to Delhi. I didn't know that the bus could be a feminine. It was beyond my imagination. So the thing is that what I'm trying to say is that as language teachers, how can we not take the child's or the learner's internal world into account? How can we not take the social structure? How can we not take the cultural bearings of the learners? If we do not take, our teaching is haphazard. So the thing is that every teacher has to know where the learner is coming from, especially language teachers, because the very common example that my teacher in Oxford gave us, that in Finland, there are 10 words for snow, because snow is such a snow happens is so much there in their physical world that they have to have 10 words. In my Odia language, I think we don't even have a word for snow. We just have one word, baraf, which means snow, ice, solidified water, everything. There's only one word, right? Because it's not there in my culture. So the thing is that how can we deny the fact that culture and language is just a reflection of culture, and the individual is a part of the culture, brought up in that culture. So our thinking or our intelligence is by the culture, and hence our language is also a reflection of. So does that mean that my language is not intelligent or your language is intelligent? No, it's the way that the thing is that because has shaped me that way, my mind is not tuned to that one. But that is why when Bernstein said more creativity in a working class mother's playing with a toy than a middle class mother, because the working class mother tries to be innovative, tries to find out how even a thing can become a toy. Like all of Like I have seen in my childhood, when cow dung and others, when I used to go to the village, people used to make dolls out of cow dungs, Can you imagine? I mean, sadly, because of our Western education or our the thought that our restrictive code or our cultural thing is not good, people nowadays don't even, I don't think they make even cow dung dolls anymore. That people used to make, they'll put one thing and they'll make a thing and they'll put two leaves for eyes and all these things. Can you see how much creativity there was? So the thing is that I think that we need to be aware of, and perhaps we should start somewhere seeing that there is creativity and it's not about difference. It is about difference and not deficit, which I talking in the last bit. I think I have to, I cannot take so much time. I have to leave some time for questions. Dr. Paira, can you tell me till how long can we have this lecture and for how long do you have question answers? How many minutes have you given to question answers? Is there any, or can I just?
30 minutes, madam. 30 minutes, 1 hour, 10 minutes you can talk, and after that we can give it to. So if they are interested in asking questions, they may ask questions in between and give permission. Okay.
I will finish it in another 10 minutes. So now the thing is that, so this is what Bernstein said, and people and staff conduct. I would like to tell this one out. So suppose, however, a person talks. Now, I sometimes feel very irritated with when some people in our university, if they are walking in the corridors, they will use their mother tongues to say hi, hello, and everything. I mean, I feel that why are you bringing, there is a staff code, right? The code is that, yes, I don't mind you talking to your colleague in your own mother tongue if you share one, but when you are in a public place, perhaps etiquette demands that you speak in a language which is commonly understood, right? So the thing is that, but then who decides this people and staff code? Who decides that a child cannot or should not speak in his mother tongue? And should the middle class decide it, or should the working class decide it? Is there a class hierarchy? And now all of us know that every institution, there is stratification is one form or the other. There is somebody who is powerful and
Madam, your screen is not visible, madam. Your screen is not visible. Please refresh it. Or
how do I refresh it?
Okay, you just go back and stop presenting and then come back and present. Okay, and then you present.
A window? Should I click on the window?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Share. No? Is it okay?
It hasn't come, ma'am.
Now?
It's coming, ma'am. It's coming.
Okay.
Okay.
So now these are some of the things, and that is what I say. The next point. First of all, we should understand that it is not deficit but difference. So, and because even though I say that there is stratification is in all kinds of society, the question we have to ask yourself is, what kind of stratification do you want? Do you want to denounce a certain cultural trait in favor of traits in favor of something else? Perhaps there is no. And all of us must understand that this is not a deficit, but a difference. Like I say that, okay, my language doesn't have gender in it, so that means my language is better than yours. Perhaps that's not the thing. Perhaps languages are different. The interpretation can be anything, and I should not be, there's a term for that, right? Ethnocentricity or whatever, you must have taught your students about that. So anyway, that is the difference and not deficit, and the uncodable parts of community life. This is a very
Madam, there is no screen again. I'm so sorry, madam, but there is no screen again.
Now, how do I do that? Stop presenting and then present, or what?
Just
Yes,
refresh
ma'am.
it. Hopefully there is no. You have a time bound. That's what I feel.
Okay.
Your screen. So just touch your.
Yeah, I did. The PowerPoint is not showing. It has to show to share. Is it okay now?
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So now, and then the third thing, which is kind of connected with the uncodable parts of community life, there is something called intent and effect. Like sometimes when I'm talking to my family members or something, some words I do not complete it, and they know exactly the meaning, right? And in organizations also the same thing. When we work with each other, we know how to deal with a certain person. So intent and effect is always there in a communication. Now some people call it a communication gap. If they want to, sometimes I've seen some colleagues, if they want to find faults with you, they'll say, no ma'am, you didn't say that, but then I say, oh, I meant it, right? So this meaning and this intent and effect, where do we draw our boundaries? And boundaries have to be drawn. There's no doubt that boundaries need not be drawn. Boundaries have to be drawn. But as a group of members of a particular group, we know where to, what is the intent and what is the effect of that, and how do we do it. Yeah. So this is what I meant. And then the crucial question that we need to ask is that how do I put suppose I'm meeting professional communication, which is the safe way to go? Is it namaste or is it hi? And then do I just do it spontaneously, or do I have a informed choice? And all of you can agree as professional communicators that we need to make informed choices on even simple things as greeting. And greeting may be a simple thing, but perhaps the first communication event that establishes relationship. So that becomes very, very crucial. Now going to the next, Vygotsky. I just put one line which I love. Thoughts are a concentrate of sense and are so denser than and will not enter words. So basically, thoughts are denser than sense, and thoughts will never enter words. That's what Vygotsky says. However, Freud contradicts this. Slip of tongue, we all know, but all of them who dealt with the psychological aspects of human beings did recognize the fact that there is an inner world where we put restrictions, and where things from the inner world do not come out to the outer world. And emotional intelligence is just a reflection of that inner world. I think I think it's Freud who said that 1/10 of the thing that we are showing in our behavior are both verbal and non-verbal, are only 1/10, and inside in our unconscious that is still 9/10 of the material. And if we do not take into account and do not at least recognize that there is 9/10 inside, how can we say that only by changing the 1/10 we are training learners? Perhaps for professional communication, this becomes a very, very important argument to rest your instruction and your teaching on, and remember that you are even the sense and thoughts thoughts, even if you get one thought, it is not the entire thought. There are thoughts and thoughts and thoughts, and one word is just a reflection of a fragment of a thought. So even if you're getting one word, just do not ignore that, because that could be a trigger to the inner world of your learner. Coming back to emotional intelligence. Now, now I'll try to pull these all threads together and kind of bring in what is communication. So communication is, in one sense, first starts with the cultural. And when I say cultural, it is from the social that the culture starts. It starts with family, kinship, and then from the social, only the organizational draws, not the other way around. Should not be the other way around, rather. And then in the next phase is that in the organizational or social or cultural communication, there is the linguistic or the languages, which is becoming more and more challenging as we are entering into a global. We are dealing with multiple languages and held multiple cultural, and that's why the non-verbal is becoming even more difficult, because in certain cultures certain non-verbal signs mean something, and certain non-verbal signs may mean completely different in some things. And that's why this is all very common, and I think as professional communicator teachers, you all are familiar with it. However, one thing what I want to say, which draws from the normative and the prescriptive, is that we are following certain norms. We need to follow. As teachers, we have to teach norms, right? However, if we are saying that these norms are the prescriptions, perhaps that's where we need to question ourselves and think that what is this prescription I'm giving, and have I diagnosed the illness properly that I'm giving this prescription? Perhaps it is better to rethink our insights or our education and think that perhaps we are not in a place to give prescriptions, because the world is changing so fast. And now I'm connecting it to what I started, like online structures, and structures itself is dynamic. Structures itself is changing every minute, and structures is changing as the way communication is happening. So anything that we do as prescription, we should know that it's liable to change, and then norms are also changing, and it's bound to change. So as long as we understand that we are operating in an ever-changing world, things would become easier for us and for our students. Now I will conclude by saying that when it says social structure, when he gave his social structure, he said that social structures give us a slave mentality, and it's only humility required to adhere to the slave mentality, or to nurture a slave mentality in order to have social structures. That's a Western philosophy, but in our Indian culture, we say that Vinayam or humility comes from education. So it's a complete opposite. For them, humility comes from a slavish mentality. For us, humility comes from egalitarian education. So where we stand, we have to question ourselves. I think I have given you the answer. In this two different dichotomous world that we all are kind of constantly negotiating through our teaching and through our making our students learn. So teaching and learning is happening from both sides. However, we need to rethink that where we have to put a kind of a draw line, so that the emotional intelligence of our learners, the emotional intelligence of our own emotional stability, and the communication strategies or the communication skills that we are teaching our students help the social structures. Not with a negative attitude, but with a positive humility that yes, as we go about in our day-to-day life, we are becoming better individuals, we are becoming emotionally intelligent, and yes, our communication skills is increasing or becoming more effective in order to make our social structures better. With this positive note, I end my talk. I am open for questions. And in the references list, I have put down the references. If you need anything else, I would be very happy to share with you. Thank you all for listening.
Madam, I have a question,
Yes,
ma'am.
please.
How, madam, social structure influence emotional intelligence? Can you explain with suitable examples?
Social structures and emotional intelligence.
How it is influence, how social structure influence emotional intelligence? Can you explain with suitable examples, ma'am?
Yes, I can. Let's say social structures of family. Suppose when my father died, the way I handle my mother, and if my boss dies, the way I handle my boss, completely two different things. Both are social structures, right? My family is my social structure, and my let's say my colleague is I'm not bound to her by organization. Let's say it's not a formal. So if a colleague or a neighbor, let's say neighbor. So my neighbor is my social structure. A neighbor and a colleague, they need to be dealt with in different ways, right? That's how I think that emotionally intelligent person deals with them differently. Even for that matter, how I deal with my father and how I deal with my father-in-law will be two different things, even though they are both social structures.
Madam, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Madam, you had rightly talked about intent and effect. That means having read something in between the lines, right? I wanted to talk about the other part of the story, like when we say something, but we have like in our mind something else. So the things are not depicted by our words. That also happens sometimes. Are you getting my point?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So please, can you elaborate? Like sometimes it happens that the words are not exactly carrying out the feelings what I have that moment about that particular context. So that creates misunderstanding sometimes because my words are not exactly the way I'm feeling it that time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's again, that's not to do with your emotional intelligence, but perhaps that's to do with speaking and reading, writing, we say. That's why we say speaking is difficult than reading and writing, because
Right.
when you do writing, you have time to use your intelligence and to use,
Yes.
you name it properly. When we are speaking, you are spontaneous. But then again, I can connect it to your culture, because see, when in your restrictive code, all of us are very comfortable with a restrictive code, right? So
Right.
when we are communicating with our family members, even if we say the wrong things, we just don't hesitate to correct it immediately. But in an organizational or formal structure, we feel immediately the sense of guilt come. Oh, why did I say that? I'm so foolish. So I start questioning my own emotional intelligence rather than, kind of forgiving myself for the thing that, look, I'm in an unfamiliar situation. I'm with a person with whom I'm not very friendly. So I made this, or maybe my intelligence failed me. So the thing is that, but you can do this choices, or you can make this informed choices only when we are aware of it. So perhaps this exercise should give us the thought. And that is why when I teach people to speak, I tell them, where is the script? So I tell them, I have to get a script from you before I allow you for presentation. So basically what I'm trying to tell them is that you emotionally control your thought first before you pen down, before you speak. So the thing is that, and all of us, like I for one cannot give a lecture without a PowerPoint, because I think that my PowerPoint helps me in emotionally becoming intelligent. So that's my way of putting it. So there's nothing wrong in what you're saying, but perhaps that's an example of how we can teach ourselves to become emotionally intelligent. I hope
Absolutely, madam. That guilt sometimes is making me feel like I should not be that emotionally intelligent. That's what. That's what.
No, first of all, you should not be guilty, because your learning starts from your culture. How can you do away with it? So that's fine, and speaking is spontaneous. So your spontaneous thinking cannot be your informed thinking, right?
Right. Thank you, ma'am.
And the previous question, have I answered your question?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
No, the previous person I'm asking, somebody asked me the question about social structure and intelligence. Did I answer that? Are you happy with the answer? Or
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you,
yeah.
ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. Anybody, anyone else who wants to ask questions?
Can I?
Yes.
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah. I just wanted to, good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Dr. Debashita from IMIS, Bhubaneswar. I just had a generic specific question, if I can say, like, it is mostly expected that those who are emotionally intelligent people, they would, justify every position where they stand. But how does it happen that that a person cannot be called as or claim as emotionally intelligence by nature? It happens gradually, or maybe through passage of time that comes out. So how do we deal with such a situation, or how do we claim, how do we make ourselves emotionally intelligent at all specific situations?
No, first of all, I mean, I don't think you have to set out one day and sit down and say, I'll be emotionally intelligent. I don't think that happens that way. However, when we are communicating or when we are dealing with social situations, we can, reflect on the situation instead of being spontaneous, like it has connections to the previous question. So if I have to deal with a situation, especially in a formal situation, like let's say I have an job interview. Can I be emotionally intelligent for a job interview? The answer is yes, I can. Can I be emotionally intelligent at my father's funeral? The answer is no, I cannot be. So the thing is that it is not about you need to know where and how you need to be intelligent and how you can cultivate that. That's more important than a general strategy for becoming emotional intelligence. I don't think it works like that. Each of us are emotional people, and it's good to be emotional. We have to be emotional because we are human. I mean, can I suggest anyone not to be human? They want to be emotional? Perhaps not. We have to know how to deal with our emotions. And then that is why when we are in a formal situation, that is where the damage becomes more, when we are not emotionally intelligent. But in a social structure, in a family, even if you cry, if I cry in front of my son is not going to denounce me or judge me. But the thing is that if I cry in front of my colleagues, they are going to see that, oh, she's a weak leader. So I need to be emotionally intelligent in that context. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, anyone else, or shall we close the session? Shall we call it a day? Okay, thank you so much, madam. That is an insightful talk that you have given. You have taken us back to sociology, you have taken us back to psychology, you have the difference between psychology and sociology and language. As a language teachers, we teach language, but no, how language is very, very important to put us in a social structure, and how best we can speak it so that the emotional EI is also coming in the language, and how best you can take EI in the language and write it or speak it wherever you feel like, or whatever you feel like. That's a great session, by the way. Thank you so very much, for this.
Thank you all. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to bring my psychology, sociology, and my language skills. Yes, thank you for challenging me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, ma'am. Thank you to have you, and I hope in the coming sector also you will be there with us whenever we call you. But because I give a small notice. No, you know that I give a very small notice. But thank you. With so much of pressed work, also you agreed upon and you come. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Okay.
And thank you all the participants. And I hope that you might have got the feedback form, and you are requested to put across and complete it and send it back. That will be counted as your attendance also. Any other from the audience? from any other questions? No? Thank you very much. And there are so many things that is a very nice session. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you
Thank
so
you all for the lovely messages that you are sending. So it really makes one happy to get this.
Thank you.
Now, and I hope to meet you all somewhere in our academic journey together.
Ma'am, please can you share your contact details, please? Your mail ID or your contact number, please.
I will, certainly. How do I do that?
Ma'am, if you convey it to sir, sir will be conveying it to us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Amanda, just share my details, mail ID and other things with them.
Yeah, ma'am. Definitely. I'll do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the PPT also, some people have asked for PPT. I'll share the PPT with Dr. Pandey, so he will circulate it to everyone. So I will send it to you.
Thank you, ma'am.